This will be a bit different of a lesson. I told you last week we're going to be studying the Olivet Discourse, which is end times type stuff. And I think it still funnels into our discipleship topic well. That will come more towards the end of it, because he's going to teach. He's going to give his teaching in Matthew 24. Matthew 25 is mostly parables that relate to the teaching that he just gave. So we can't go into detail on everything, even within what we're studying in detail. Won't be able to do detail on everything, but I didn't think we could get out of Matthew by skipping the biggest prophecy thing that's actually in Matthew and Jesus' teaching on it. So we'll be doing that tonight, and we have a lot to cover. So I'll just pray and we can get started. Lord, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the time in your word, and just pray that you would help us to understand what you said so many years ago. And I pray that it would be a help and encouragement to us, even though it's a sort of dark topic. We just thank you for it. We thank you for your word. Pray you'd be with us. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so last week we talked about divorce. We talked about the triumphal entry and cleansing the temple, and we talked about the render unto Caesar concept. This week we are understanding to some extent the Olivet Discourse, how this should shape our lives. The disclaimer here is that I am not an expert in prophecy. I imagine this will raise many, many questions. I promise you I don't have all the answers, not only because I don't know the future, but I'm just not an expert in even biblical prophecy. Hopefully I can answer any questions related to this text at least. But I imagine it will raise a host of other questions in your mind, which I may or may not be able to answer. Pastor may know more on those topics. Ron knows a lot on those topics. So maybe we'll tag team it tonight, all three of us. We'll see what happens. All right, so because we've been skipping some stuff in the book of Matthew, before we got into the prophecy, I want to give a little bit of context. And I want to use this as an opportunity to set up how we think about prophecy before we actually get into what Jesus says. I think that will be helpful for us tonight. So on your sheet there, just the context, when Jesus is going to start talking, he's in the middle of denouncing those rejecting him as the Messiah. So if you read chapter 23, that is one of the most scathing chapters from Jesus towards the religious leaders. And he starts talking about this idea that Jerusalem, Judea will be judged. So I want to read those last few verses in chapter 23 to show you how this ends. So Matthew 23:37, Jesus says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, but ye would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. So the whole chapter is rough. It's just Jesus is really going at it. It's towards the end of his earthly ministry, and he's not holding back on denouncing the sins of the leaders and the Jewish people. So it's important to know that he's a little hot under the collar here, and justly so. And you'll see that play out in how chapter 24 starts. But before we get into that, before we actually read the text, I want to do a little bit about understanding prophecy. So first thing on your sheet there, understanding prophecy. Prophecy in the Bible is often not a simple matter of fortune telling. And what I mean by that is, I prophesy this will happen, and that's the end of it. It's not often, sometimes, but it is not typically just a one-off, prophet prophesies this thing, and then that thing just comes to pass. So we don't have time to do a full study of it, but I write, notice how Matthew uses prophecy about the Messiah. We've talked about some of it. Prophecies explicitly about Israel, David, Solomon. They act on multiple horizons. So something that is prophesied about the son of David, King Solomon, will then get applied to the son of David, the future Messiah. So to keep going with that, prophecies typically have immediate fulfillments, usually partial, that create patterns and crescendos leading to the ultimate thing to which they point. And I said this happens with prophecy, which is spoken prophecy, and this happens with typology, which we've talked about as living prophecies. For example, you see someone like Joseph in Genesis. He's often considered a type, a living prophecy of Christ, because what plays out in his life, you can see reflected in the Messiah, certain things with David, Solomon. Moses acts as a type of Christ, as the mediator between God and the children of Israel, stuff like that. Okay, I didn't get that far, but do we understand what we're saying there? Prophecy often creates types and patterns. So a really good example is if you read Isaiah 7 and 8. That's where you get the typical Christmas passage that we read that Matthew uses, that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel. When you look at that in its historical context, the next chapter, a virgin, a woman who was a virgin, conceives and bears a son, and it acts as a sign to the king of Israel. And then, because it's God with us, Emmanuel, and they know that God is supposed to be coming to the people of Israel later, Matthew interprets this as not just having to do with Isaiah, although it did, but also pointing ahead to the future God with us. So that's like a really simple example where there's a historical context, and then the biblical authors see it playing out over a longer time horizon. Okay. So, continuing on, in this discourse, we will see Jesus using similar language to the Old Testament prophets as they often used when speaking about judgment on a nation that have historical fulfillments. A couple examples. Isaiah 34 is about judgment on Edom. Ezekiel 32 is about judgment on Egypt. Now, I wanted to just read you a couple verses from Ezekiel 32 so you see what I'm talking about here. So Ezekiel 32 is about judgment on Egypt. The verses that I clipped out will show this to you plainly. But notice the language that gets used. So Ezekiel 32 says, "And it came to pass in the 12th year, in the 12th month, in the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say unto him," jumping down a little bit, "When I shall put thee out, I will cover the heavens, make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord God. For thus saith the Lord God, the sword of the king of Babylon shall come upon thee." So I read that in particular because while we discuss what we believe to be the correct view of what Jesus is going to say, I will point out areas where very common views of the end times will go against what we believe is going to happen. And I want to prime the pump for that a little bit so it makes sense as to why we don't agree with them. So some of that language that I read is about very cosmic stuff happening, and Jesus is going to use that language too. Ezekiel talks about it, is using poetic language about a historical event, Egypt being conquered by Babylon. And we're going to have to look at how we grapple with that and see if Jesus is doing the same thing or pointing to something different. So keep that in mind. So with that in mind, the last section here, the early church, instead of reading Jesus' words through Isaiah or other prophets, read his words through Daniel, specifically chapter 9. And I bring this up because in the Olivet Discourse, at a certain point, Jesus is going to start using some of that prophetic language of cosmic events happening. Now, there are other camps in the church, not this church, in the church at large, who say, look, Ezekiel used this language about Egypt. This doesn't have to be big cosmic end of the world stuff, because they're reading Jesus through Ezekiel's language. They're reading it through some of Isaiah's language. But the early church, because of Jesus being the Messiah, being the Son of Man, read it through the primary text where that comes from, which is Daniel chapter 9. That's a whole big sprawling vision that Daniel has that talks about the Son of Man and how he doesn't use the word crucified, but how the Son of Man is killed, raised again to glory. And then after these calamities, it's the resurrection of the dead. So you can think, oh, maybe Jesus is just using some poetic language. But according to Daniel, which is how the early church is understanding Jesus and his mission and his ministry, they say, well, yeah, but when this happens, the dead are supposed to be raised. There's supposed to be final judgment. And I should have made a note for you guys about some of the early church writers who wrote about this, because they're writing in the 2nd century, so between 1 and 200 AD. They were very well versed in their Bibles and knew very well that while Jerusalem does get destroyed, the resurrection of the dead has definitely not happened yet. The final judgment has definitely not happened yet. So they logically interpret it through Daniel, and then they go from there. All right, I threw a lot at you in 15 minutes. Do we mostly understand what we're saying here? Okay. And I wanted to bring up how the messianic prophecies often work in the patterns and cycles leading up to the fulfillment in Jesus, because it seems like that's what happens with end times prophecy as well. Even when there are certain historical things that you can kind of link them to, they seem to have that same pattern and crescendo, because evil follows a script, it follows a pattern, and God's redemption has a pattern to it, God's judgment has a pattern to it. So that's why I said in the Bible, prophecy is often not what we think of as like just fortune telling. It has a bigger cosmic pattern script that God is playing out on a stage that is hard for us to comprehend at times. So that's why I know that's dense, but I wanted to give us that setup here. And to start this chapter, I just want to read the first 3 verses, and then we'll launch in. All right, so Jesus just angrily left the temple, more or less. Chapter 24, verse 1, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the building of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Should be a simple few verses there. But what I want us to see, well, I'll point out a couple things real quick. So, verse 1, Jesus went out and departed. In the Greek, this is very extreme language. When it says he departed, he's not coming back. Jesus, he's done with the temple and what's going on there. He didn't just leave for the day. And the disciples, seemingly trying to cheer him up, I would think, because he just had such a angry, emotional, justified discourse. They're saying like, hey, man, isn't the temple pretty? They're sitting on the Mount of Olives, which is a mountain across from the Temple Mount. And the temple was gorgeous. Herod had renovated it extensively. And then I want us to notice the questions that are asked. So on your sheet there, note at least two, really three questions. When will these things, temple's destruction, be? What's the sign of your coming? And when is the end of the world / age? It's likely that the apostles assumed this was only one question. That's the blank there. Only one question. So first century Jews, you would imagine it would be difficult for them to think of the destruction of Jerusalem again without it being the full judgment of God and the coming kingdom. So they probably assume they're asking one question. But we see how Jesus breaks it down, and it's not one question. It's important and fits Jesus' answer to see that he splits the event into multiple questions. All right. So now we are actually going to get into the chapter. I will open it up for whatever questions you have, which I may or may not be able to answer, and then we'll continue on. So we're going to read verses 4 through 14. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another, and many false prophets shall arise and deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. All right, a lot of problems in those verses going on. Any opening thoughts or questions there? That is a astute observation. Yeah. So notice how I titled this section at the bottom of your page, Not Yet. So it's funny because he asks, the disciples' question is, when is the temple going to be destroyed? What's the sign of your coming, the end of the world? And he starts listing things, and he says, you're going to see this, and the end is not yet. And then you're going to see this. And then, so he kind of starts his thing by telling him what isn't the sign of his coming in the end of the age. We'll dig into another detail there. Anything else? Anything else that jumped out at you there? All right, I can explain some things, and then if you have questions about the things I explained, we can go that way. I wrote exactly what I told you just there. Note that he starts off by telling the disciples things that are not signs of the end. So verse 6 and verse 14. All right, so verses 4 through 8, these events will happen all throughout the church's history until the return of Christ, likely escalating. Because as Cindy pointed out, all these things happen, all these things have happened, all these things happened in the time of Christ, and they happened before the time of Christ. And he's also saying they're not the sign. So that's important to know, because for a lot of reasons it's important to know. One, by understanding that, he's not wrong. So you could be like, oh, wars and rumors of wars. What about World War I and World War II? Those are big. No, he explicitly said this is not the sign, And so if we look at from the time of Jesus saying this up until sometime in the future, all these things are going to be happening. But they're not the sign, because it's not the end yet. However, I think it seems that these things will escalate in some fashion. And the reason that I would say that is on your sheet there, sorrows. Jesus says this is the beginning of sorrows in verse 8, refers to a woman's labor pains. The world itself is imaged as a woman who's going to give birth to its new creation. Of course, that's metaphor. God is going to make the new creation. Paul teaches the same concept in Romans 8:19 through 23. He talks about the entire world groans as it awaits the new creation. So when you have these ideas together, you would think, okay, so knowing how labor pains work, they become more intense and more frequent right up until the end of that. So based on that, there would be reason to think that these kind of things would escalate and keep going like that. But yeah, it's almost like not that they were anything, Jesus wasn't explaining something that the disciples hadn't already heard of. They weren't like, oh, I've never heard of a famine, I've never heard of a war. But their continued existence and their escalation, it's not the sign, but you can almost take them all together over the course of history as a collective sign of these labor pains that the world is going through as a consequence of sin, if that makes sense. And he ends that whole section with verse 14, that the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come. And on your sheet there, I said verse 14 links us to Revelation 14, 6 through 7. That's a very interesting passage where God actually sends an angel to proclaim, I don't even know how to visualize what's happening in that passage, but somehow an angel proclaims the kingdom, proclaims some gospel to the inhabitants of the world, and then you really start to see certain things kick off. And so while, because people make arguments about not arguments, but people make the case oh, the gospel has been preached to all nations by now. One, you can make an argument from the New Testament based on some language Paul uses, But then even now they're like, well, the gospel's on the internet. People preach the gospel on the internet all the time, and every nation on earth is in some way touched by the internet. So like, oh, the gospel has been preached to all nations. You could make that argument. Missions work is still important, but it seems like right before the end really starts to go, God is going to do something about it. So you kind of get Paul's language of like, so no man is without no man is without excuse, or has an excuse. Okay, after I explained that, any more questions? Any more thoughts here? This is actually going a lot faster than I expected it to. I would imagine so, yes. Yeah, I didn't really get too much into rapture stuff in this lesson just because it's beyond the scope of this chapter. I do think you can argue for some evidence of a rapture in this chapter. Definitely actually we probably are skipping over the stuff at the end that's like more explicitly rapture. We might have time. We might look at that real quick at the end. But all right, so we're going to read a little bit more of a chunk of text here. So we're going to read Matthew 24:15 through 31. So this is actually the sign. We read about what is not the sign. Now this is the sign. All right, because verse 14 ends, and then the end shall come. So verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in a secret chamber, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. All right. Thoughts or questions there? No, so that's in Revelation. Yeah, so there's more detail given in Revelation. Of course, the whole book's about that. Revelation 19. Yeah. So Revelation has that absolute end of the age when Christ is coming to judge, where he comes back, white horse, whatever that looks like, with his saints. Then you get that. You can tie in that fun Jude passage from the book of Enoch with the coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment, that whole thing. I would imagine that's what's happening in verse 31. I would imagine that's the same timeline, even though there's less detail here. That seems right. Pastor's nodding his head, so I think we're safe on that one. Yeah. Yeah, any other thoughts there? Yeah, you see, and I don't even think we could do a 13-week study of like Revelation or something like that. Yeah, you almost need Revelation like if you want the details, you almost need Revelation hand in hand with like these chapters. They are remarkably well related, because John would have directly heard this teaching and then had visions elaborating on it. So these cataclysmic type cosmic rending events, they're sort of, so this is another reason why we talk about things that happen in cycles within the working of God. So you have these things in the Bible that they refer to as like decreation judgment events. So, we're familiar with the days of creation. You don't need this much detail. There are 10 times that God speaks in creating the world. 7 days, but there are 10 God saids in it, the 10 words of God. And then you have 10 plagues on Egypt. And it's kind of like this spiritual, like cosmic decreation where instead of let there be light, in Egypt the sun's going dark. The water is like turning to blood, that kind of stuff. And, so then God, through the prophets, uses that. That's why I pointed out some of that stuff from Ezekiel. He uses that language when he talks about coming destruction on certain nations in the past, like Egypt at the hands of Babylon. And then as it keeps ramping up and crescendoing into the final, we believe, because of the way that escalates from chapters like this and from the way it's described in Revelation, that you're actually getting that's kind of the judgment that's being poured out during that tribulation time. It's this cosmic decreation as God is getting ready to judge and create the new heavens and new earth. Yeah, because when you get saved, he calls you a new creation as well. Like being a new creation, you're fit to inhabit what will be the new creation, and you're kind of waiting for that crossover and that kind of stuff. I don't know, I talked for a while. Did I answer your question? Okay. Good. Yeah, anything else with this? If not, we can turn to the notes. Right. Yeah, because you have the phrase when he talks about they'll see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens, and people have all sorts of unfounded theories on what the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens actually is, but it's a big deal, whatever it is. Yeah, there are a lot of other signs that should make it obvious before that, but yeah, there's something big that happens. All right, so with this section, all the way back to verse 15. So what the sign actually is, that the end is very near, is the abomination of desolation. So, and this is interesting and shows how Jesus understands prophecy to be working on multiple horizons and to be cyclical. Okay, so verse 15, he says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." And then the whole thing progresses. So the abomination of desolation is spoken of in Daniel 11:31 specifically, and kind of all around that area. So this is very interesting because Daniel prophesies about this abomination who will desecrate the holy place of God, the temple. So in a couple hundred years, when the Seleucids invade Judea, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes is the leader of that people group, and when they take over, they outlaw the Jewish, practicing the Jewish faith, and he has a pig sacrificed on the temple altar, thereby desecrating it. So most people consider him to be a very plain fulfillment of the abomination of desolation. And that's what Hanukkah is about. When the Maccabean revolt happens, they kick out the Seleucids, and they have this big ceremony feast of rededicating the temple to God. However, the book of Daniel talks about a lot of these things happening, and then shortly after, as Daniel talks about them, you have things like the resurrection of the dead. And you go, well, that didn't happen. And Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. He was a good Second Temple Jewish man. In the book of John, they refer to the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. He actually goes to the temple to celebrate. He is very aware of the book of Daniel, as we see, he quotes it, and he's very aware of the Jewish history of the temple desecration and dedication. And yet, as he's pointing to a sign for the end of the world, he says, when you see the abomination that Daniel wrote about, then all this stuff. So he sees Daniel's prophecy maybe having a partial fulfillment a couple hundred years before, and then he's pointing to the future to say, you're going to see like the true abomination of desolation. He's working on that same cyclical crescendoing concept of how evil is operating in prophecy, how God's judgment and restoration will operate in prophecy. So he points to a past event that seems, the way Jesus points to it, it's almost like Antiochus Epiphanes was just almost like a type, like a foreshadowing of what was ultimately going to come, because he's so well aware of who this guy was, who did, like what Daniel was saying, and he uses that exact language to point ahead in time. So you see his logic with that, even though it's interesting. So as far as I can tell, that is correct. So I actually have it as, on your sheet, I'll get to the some believed this happened thing. This is the same as the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2, the Antichrist that John is talking about, and the beast of Revelation 13. So these are all completely linked together. They just use some different language for them. So what I have on your sheet there, some believe this happened in 70 AD. We talked about this, that some people believe that this discourse from Jesus and like 99% of the book of Revelation happened in 70 AD, and they're using this poetic, prophetic language to describe fairly normal events, catastrophic events, but fairly normal events. But it has major issues if you're going to take anything that's being said seriously. Now you can take poetic language seriously. There is metaphor, there's poetry, there's symbolism in the Bible, for sure. I think there's a category error when you take Jesus' opening statements in this whole chapter of, this temple is going to be thrown down, there's not one stone that's going to be left on another. You take that completely literally, and then you take the rest of it completely spiritually, metaphorically, and he's also saying things like, this is going to be the end of the world, and God's going to come and judge all nations, and he's going to gather his holy ones together, and all these very much cosmic end of age things. And you want all of that to be not literal, but you want Jesus' initial statements and their question to be literal. Like
the preterists, they don't like that. They don't use that word much anymore.
Fulfilled eschatology.
Yes.
Because it's worth noting what Jesus said about not one stone left upon another. That literally happened. That the temple did not just get wrecked; it got destroyed. So when the Roman armies came in, because the temple was such a massive stronghold of a structure, a ton of Jewish people piled in there trying to stay safe. And then a fire got lit somewhere along the way, and gold from the temple's covered in gold, the gold starts melting in the fire, and it seeps down into the cracks in the bricks, the massive stones that the temple's made out of. So after many Jews just die from this intense heat, many are, like all of them are slaughtered. Probably hundreds of thousands of Jewish people died in this war. And because of what happened with the gold melting, the Roman soldiers actually were ordered to take it apart brick by brick so they could scrape out all the gold, because they're completely plundering the temple. So like, as literal of a prophecy as you can get happened when Jesus said the temple was going to be destroyed, and in what way? Oh, they lost a lot of documents. That's what you mean? Yeah. Because the temple is, you have the temple proper where you do the sacrifices and all that stuff, but you have the whole temple complex. You have libraries, scribal things. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Okay, so we got 15 minutes left. We can do this. Verse 16, just to throw it out there, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. I made a note that this, in fact, saved many Christians from Rome. So they saw armies approaching, like the Christians still, after the time of Jesus, Christians still in Jerusalem, Judea. They see an army coming against Jerusalem. Now, they don't know that it's not going to be the end of the age at this point, but they know Jesus' words, and fearing what might happen, Christians got out of Dodge because of the teaching of Jesus, and that actually ended up saving a lot of Christians. The Jews did not. The Jews wanted to fight to the death. Kind of broad note, verses 15 through 28 constitute the great tribulation that will occur before the return of Christ, which I think you can see why. Verse 28, just because it's a weird one, as Jesus is ending this little segment, he says, "For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." I put a note from a commentary here. It says, this is a difficult statement. It was probably a figure of speech with the idea of when judgment is ripe, it will surely come. And it's worth noting, in Aramaic, there's no distinction for large birds. It's one word. So some people think he's probably referring to like vultures, something like vultures going to dead bodies, something like that, because eagles don't really do carrion. But okay. So verses 29 through 31 that we read is what we would call the true end of the age. That's what Cindy was pointing out, the cosmic shaking that is occurring, the powers of heaven being darkened. All right, so we only read up to verse 31. I want to read you verse 34, you've heard this, but just to put it in context of the whole thing. So, verse 34, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." All right, so this is what people speculate on this a lot. What generation? What does that mean? So if you are in that camp that thinks all of this already happened, you take that stance, then they use this as what they think is a silver bullet, because they go, oh, the generation Jesus is talking to, about 40 years later, the temple's destroyed. Okay, Jesus says you need to look for the abomination of desolation. Like, that's the sign of the end. So, while yes, the generation that Jesus is speaking to will mostly not pass away until the temple's destroyed, but his whole thing about the end of the world, the sign is the abomination of desolation. So, What generation? Okay, I said that. Those who believe the whole event took place in 70 AD say that plainly Jesus is speaking to the current 33 AD generation. That only works if you take the prediction about the temple's destruction literally, but everything else spiritually or metaphorically. This also requires that you don't take the coming of the Son of Man, as Daniel did, which ties the event to the resurrection and judgment. Given that, it would seem he means that the generation who sees the sign, the abomination of desolation, is the generation that will not pass away until the end of the age happens. Once the end starts, it will be completed quickly. All right, so we're going to skip. Yeah, we're basically out of time. 10 minutes. So we're going to skip. Oh, I see. No, so he is referring to like the generation won't pass away. So while Revelation gives us much more clear timelines, and the book of Daniel actually gives much more clear timelines. So he's saying like, okay, the sign of the end. It's not like, oh, here's a sign of the end, and then you have another 100 years. It's just like, while he's not doing the same, he's not including the timelines that something like Daniel or Revelation has, he does seem to be saying that, once this sign happens, like, there's not long. You're not going to have generations of people. You're not even, the people, not that everyone is going to live out their days, but it's basically, once this happens, it's happening fast. Basically, yeah. Yeah, see, this is where people do confuse like a position like what we hold. So people from other traditions, other camps, they'll say like, why are you waiting for a temple to be built? There's like, it won't be proper worship. Like the Son of God has already been crucified. The law is fulfilled. We don't need a temple. And they go, no, like we don't need a temple. The Bible seems to indicate that something is going to happen with a temple at the end of the age, which just means if there's no temple standing, I feel like you have some breathing room, at least a little bit. But it's just, no, like we don't need a temple to be built. It just seems like something's happening in a temple, so the temple will at some point be built. And it's worth noting, like when people push back on that, they say like, oh no, it's got to be talking about 70 AD because that's when the temple fell. There's no temple now. Ezekiel, read the end of Ezekiel, the last 8 chapters, when he is prophesying this wild temple. He is giving that prophecy at a time where there is no temple in Jerusalem. Babylon has flattened that temple. When Daniel talks about his abomination of desolation desecrating the Jewish temple, there is still no temple currently standing. That wouldn't be built until the captives go back and rebuild. So the idea that Jesus and then John in Revelation are talking about an abomination of desolation standing in a temple that, as you're reading Revelation is probably written around AD 90. So like the idea that he's writing about a temple that's not standing yet shouldn't be a shock, So yeah, I understand why people say that, but I have no issue with prophecy doing actual prophecy stuff. Like, there's no temple now. How can that happen in the future? Well, that's kind of how prophecy works. Jesus wasn't around until the Messiah came around. So, yeah. Yeah. And I think it's worth saying, since we're on the topic, I hold that future, to us now, future prophecy, I believe is not meant to bring absolute clarity. In the same way that the prophecies about Jesus make 100% more sense in hindsight, and Jesus keeping his messianic secret until the time is right. We talked about in Jesus' temptation in the wilderness that the devil doesn't even seem to know exactly what's going on. He knows who it is. He doesn't know the plan. And then Paul says if they knew basically, if they knew what would happen, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory, the forces of darkness, because they didn't know that his death would lead to human redemption. His death would lead to their end. So in the same way that the messianic prophecies are intentionally vague, I think future prophecy is meant to be intentionally vague in a way that causes you to have a certain level of understanding that leads to some clarity, a lot of hope, a lot of warnings, a lot of things like that. But in the same way that the Messiah's first coming wasn't spelled out intentionally, I think his second coming is not spelled out intentionally.
There's some mystery to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like broad strokes, not a lot of details that you can cling to. All right, so I knew we would basically just get through most of this chapter. So we only have 1 week left. So we're not picking this back up next week. I never planned to. So I gave you some optional homework that I called it, just optional reading if you want to. So if you want to continue on in Matthew 24, and if you want to read Matthew 25, that's where the more practical discipleship element of this stuff comes in. And I did just want to give you the baseline concepts here. So there's a parable that ends Matthew 24, and then there's two in Matthew 25, and then there's something about the final judgment at the end of Matthew 25. But the blanks on your sheet here. So Jesus gives three parables after this teaching. We have the parable of the wicked servant, and the point of this is just fill in returning soon. So yeah, it's a parable about a servant that a master leaves in charge, and he doesn't realize that the master is coming back so soon, and he is not behaving well. We can put it that way. He's violent and abusive and not doing what the master wanted him to do. The master comes back before he expects it, and that does not go well. So then you have the parable of the 10 virgins. And this fill in preparing to wait. So it's a parable about basically a wedding party in a lot of Jewish wedding traditions that don't really resonate with us today. But basically they're supposed to be waiting for the groom, basically bridesmaids waiting for the groom to come with the bride. And they're supposed to have lamps with oil in them. And 5 of them are wise. They bring extra oil. They're prepared to wait longer than expected. 5 of them don't. And you get this wise versus foolish servants there. And then the parable of the talents. It's easy to forget that, like, you know this parable, but it's easy to forget that it's connected to Jesus talking about the end of the world. So here I just had not investing. And if you're familiar with the parable of the talents, you understand what I mean by that. So it's interesting that Jesus has this whole big discourse about the end of the age, and then his first 2 parables are in tension with each other. Because the first one is about someone who was acting like the king wasn't coming back. So this is about a parable about the master that returned sooner than expected. And then you have the parable of the 10 virgins, which is they didn't know they would have to wait so long. So you have these 2 complete, like the complete opposite problems, and this is how Jesus chooses to explain in parable form the coming of the kingdom of God. And then no matter where you fall on that spectrum, whether you're born closer to the time and Jesus is coming sooner than you thought, or you were born 1,000 years ago and you have to wait, the parable of the talents tells us what to be doing in the meantime, which is using, investing the things that God's given us. So if most of chapter 24 doesn't seem too devotional to you, doesn't seem too imminently practical, the way Jesus applies it in parable should definitely be. So if you want the most out of it, you feel free to read that and think about that. So next week, text for next week is the rest of Matthew somehow. I am going to have to pick and choose what we talk about there. Now, fortunately, we are all familiar with the rest of the story. At this point, you basically have the betrayal, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. So there shouldn't be any plot twists, no surprises there. And I will see how we wrap that up. But yeah, that's what we have for tonight. I'll close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the time in your word, and just pray that we would be able to understand what you have for us, that you would continue to bring clarity and help us to consider how we should be applying this to our lives, how we should be living and thinking and following you. So we thank you for your word, the warning, and the hope in that. Pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.